You just slapped the woman who built your reputation, Adrian.
Kirabo, wait. What are you doing?
Starting tonight, I am withdrawing permission to use all 27 designs. She can't be serious. Starting tonight, you're going to learn who really built this company.
I never thought it would come to this.
Her mother-in-law dropped her wine glass. Adrian's younger sister turned pale. Kirabo looked directly into her husband's eyes and said, "Starting tonight, you are going to learn who really built this company." Kirabo Nansuboga walked through the glass door of Kintu Meridian Development's headquarters in Nakasero, Kampala. Sunlight spread across the cream-colored marble floor, reflecting off bronze decorative panels and framed pieces of bar cloth lining the grand lobby. Dressed in a teal suit over a turmeric gold silk blouse, Kirabo looked as composed as she did every morning. But the brass mechanical pencil in her hand had stopped moving. Something was wrong. On the large screen behind the reception desk was an image of the new resort the company was preparing to build beside Lake Victoria. The curved roofs inspired by fishing boats, the interior gardens modeled after terrace farmland, and the banana leaf-shaped bronze lighting system had all been developed by Kirabo over 14 months. She had revised the design 6 times, worked with 3 engineering teams, and personally traveled to Masaka to meet artisans and select materials. Yet beneath the image, only one line appeared: the creative vision of Adrian Sentongo. Kirabo stood still long enough for the receptionist to notice the change in her eyes. "Miss Kirabo, the investor meeting file has been placed on your desk," the receptionist said quietly. Mr. Adrian asked everyone to review it before the presentation. Kirabo nodded, thanked her, and walked toward the elevator. She did not ask who had approved the sentence on the screen. During her 8 years at her husband's family company, she had learned that some answers were not found in explanations, but in the fact that people believed they owed no explanation at all. The 12th floor was quieter than usual. Employees in brightly colored office attire moved through the corridor carrying tablets, blueprints, and steaming cups of Ugandan coffee. When Kirabo appeared, several people smiled and greeted her, but 2 young members of the design team quickly closed the document they had been reading. The gesture made her stop. On Kirabo's desk sat a black embossed folder bearing the Kintu Meridian emblem. Inside was the complete proposal intended to persuade investors to approve an expansion deal worth 18,760,000 Ugandan shillings. She turned through the financial section, the operating strategy, and the construction plan before reaching the design chapter. The first page named Adrian as the creator of the overall concept. The next credited Malaika with developing the visual language. Kirabo's name did not appear. She continued turning the pages slowly and carefully. 27 designs, from the resort in Entebbe to the chain of luxury offices across Kampala, were presented as the work of Adrian and the in-house creative team. Kirabo's handwritten notes had been retyped. The photographs she had taken during the research process were used without attribution. Even a sentence she had written in the original design brief appeared beneath her husband's portrait. Kirabo closed the folder. She carried it down the corridor to Adrian's office. Through the frosted glass, he stood in front of the window wearing a charcoal suit and speaking on the phone in his familiar, confident voice. His father's antique watch gleamed on his wrist, the one Adrian always adjusted before entering an important negotiation. Kirabo waited until he ended the call, then placed the folder on his desk. "Why was my name removed from the entire distinction?" Adrian looked at the folder before looking at his wife. He did not appear surprised, and he did not apologize. "No one removed you," he replied. "We are building one consistent brand story. Investors need to see a clear leader, not a long list of contributors. I am not one name on a list. Kirabo, do not turn a communications decision into a marital problem." She looked at the man who had stood beside her at the altar 8 years earlier. Back then, Adrian had promised they would build everything as equals. But with each project, his name had grown larger on the stage while hers had become smaller in the footnotes. You called my design your vision. Adrian sighed and lowered himself into his chair, as though she were the one making his morning difficult. The company carries my family's name. I am the chief executive. Your work contributes to our shared success, and shared success needs one public face. Then, what am I? You are my wife. The answer was spoken softly. But it changed everything. Kirabo did not argue. She opened the folder one final time, looked at the familiar drawings, and placed her brass mechanical pencil horizontally across the page, bearing Adrian's photograph. Then she asked who had approved the transfer of all the design files to the newly created subsidiary. Adrian's expression shifted, only for a second. You do not need to worry about those procedures, he said. Focus on completing the presentation. Kirabo carried the folder back to her office. She closed the door, unlocked the bottom drawer, and removed the original contracts she had preserved for years. For the first time, she did not read them as a wife trying to protect her husband's family company. She read them as the woman who had created everything now being taken from her hands. Kirabo's pearl-colored Mercedes stopped in front of Flavia Nakato's villa on a quiet road in Kololo. The last light of sunset slipped through the tall palm trees, casting an orange glow across the grey stone walls and the bronze gate engraved with Ugandan cranes. Kirabo remained in the car for a few more seconds, both hands resting on the steering wheel, as she tried to organize the questions that had followed her all the way from Nakasero. She had not yet told Adrian that she had reread the contracts. Inside the villa, the aroma of steamed matok blended with chicken luwumbo and groundnut sauce drifting through the spacious dining room. A cream-woven cloth covered the inviol wood table, and a vase of bright red bird of paradise flowers stood at its center. Flavia wore a plum-purple gomesi embroidered with gold thread, while Malaika appeared in a coral orange silk dress. Her hair neatly braided and sun-shaped earrings hanging from her ears. Everything was beautiful, except the atmosphere. Adrian arrived after Kirabo, placed a quick kiss on his mother's cheek, and sat at the head of the table as though the conversation in his office had never happened. He spoke about the investors, the expansion plan, and the company's upcoming 25th anniversary celebration, which would be held at the couple's villa. Whenever he mentioned the new resort, he used the phrase "our vision," but his eyes turned only toward his mother and sister. Kirabo quietly placed a portion of matok on her plate. After Flavia's prayer, the conversation quickly shifted to the project presentation file. Malaika said enthusiastically that the communications team had selected Adrian as the central figure because international investors usually responded well to a clear leadership story. She also proudly explained that she had suggested changing the section title from Kirabo's Design Studio to the Meridian Aesthetic Language, so the brand would sound larger than one individual. Kirabo placed her spoon down. But I created those designs. Malaika raised one eyebrow slightly, as though Kirabo's statement were insignificant compared with the multi-billion shilling deal they were discussing. No one is denying that you worked very hard, she replied. But when you married Adrian and joined this company, you became part of the family. Your achievements became the family's achievements too. Then, why do the family's achievements carry only Adrian's name? The room fell silent for a moment. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his lips tightening, while Flavia adjusted the napkin on her lap. Kirabo realized that her mother-in-law had heard the question, but she was considering how to soften it rather than how to answer it. My dear, Flavia said gently, one line in a document cannot change the fact that everyone in this family knows how much you have contributed. The investors do not live in this house, but your husband is the one who must stand before them. Kirabo looked at her. For 8 years, Flavia had often praised her for being thoughtful, calm, and aware of her responsibilities as a wife in a prominent family. Those words had once made Kirabo proud. Tonight, they sounded like a beautiful cloth placed over something no one wanted to face directly. Malaika took a sip of water and added that successful women sometimes needed to step back so their husbands would not feel challenged. According to her, Adrian had lived under enormous pressure because of his late father's name. So Kirabo should help strengthen his position instead of demanding recognition at such a sensitive time. You have a career, a title, and a life many people dream of, Malaika said. Do you truly need your name on every page? Kirabo did not answer immediately. She remembered the opening of the first hotel she had designed. Adrian had pulled her close while no journalists were present, but the moment the cameras appeared, he stepped forward and introduced her simply as his wife. She remembered an architecture award ceremony in Nairobi where Adrian delivered the speech she had written word for word while she sat in the audience applauding. At the time, she had told herself they were a team. Then came the interviews featuring only Adrian, the promotional photographs without her, and the documents that gradually replaced her name with the phrase the internal team. Each time she chose silence because a project needed to be completed. Employees were waiting for their salaries, or the family was preparing for an important occasion. No one had taken her hand and forced her to step backward. She had stepped backward on her own. Adrian placed one hand on the table, his voice low but cold. I do not understand why you are turning this into a competition. We are building the family legacy. Kirabo looked directly at him. Who does a legacy belong to when it is built by erasing the name of the person who created it? Flavia softly said, Kirabo's name as a warning. She explained that every family required sacrifices that could never be written into a contract, and that a wise woman had to understand what was worth protecting and what should be overlooked. She did not intend to hurt Kirabo. That was what made it frightening. Kirabo lifted her glass of water but did not drink. She understood that if she remained at the table, they would turn her ownership, her labor, and her self-respect into a lesson about patience. Then they would call that silence maturity. She stood, thanked Flavia for dinner, and straightened the hem of her teal dress. Before leaving the table, Kirabo looked at each of them in turn. I have protected the peace for too long, she said. Perhaps that is why all of you began to believe there was nothing that needed to be fixed. For the first time, no one told her to sit down. Kirabo stepped into Solom Atim's office on the 9th floor of a modern building in Nakasero. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Kampala stretched beneath the clear morning light, terracotta rooftops rising between newly built office towers. Kirabo wore a mustard yellow business dress beneath a dark blue jacket and held a leather briefcase against her chest, filled with contracts she had preserved for 8 years. The briefcase felt heavier than she remembered. Solomi rose to greet her friend. The Acholi lawyer wore a perfectly tailored brick red suit over a silk blouse patterned with black and white geometric shapes. She did not ask whether Kirabo was all right. Her tired eyes and the way she gripped the briefcase handle had already answered that question. Put everything on the table, Solom said. We are not going to guess anymore. Kirabo opened the briefcase and removed each file, arranged by year. There were hotel design contracts, image licensing agreements, authorship declarations, and appendices Adrian had once described as nothing more than internal formalities. Beside each of Kirabo's signatures was Kintu Meridian Development's golden seal, shining like a promise that everything had been handled properly. Solom read very slowly. The only sounds in the room were turning pages, the steady hum of the air conditioner, and the distant traffic below. Kirabo watched her closest friend mark each clause with a pen, then suddenly remembered the evenings when she assigned documents at the dining table. Adrian often placed the papers in front of her when they were both exhausted, pointed to the spaces requiring signatures, and said the legal team had reviewed everything. She had trusted him. After nearly 40 minutes of uninterrupted reading, Solomi pulled one contract toward Kirabo. Clause 12 stated that authorship rights over the concepts, sketches, and spatial identity systems remained with the creator. The company was permitted to use them only for projects approved in writing by both parties. What does this mean? Kirabo asked. It means they do not own your 27 design collections. Kirabo stared at the small print beneath Solom's finger, but they have been used under the company's name for years. Being allowed to use something does not mean you own it. Solom opened 3 additional appendices. They authorized Kintu Meridian to use the designs for specific projects, but they did not permit the company to transfer those rights to a subsidiary, outside partner, or new investor without Kirabo's consent. In the most recent file, a draft assignment agreement had already been prepared, stating that all creative assets would be transferred to Meridian Lakeside Holdings once the expansion deal was completed. The space for Kirabo's signature remained blank. Adrian's signature was already below it. He never told me about this company, Kirabo whispered. Salome did not look surprised. She picked up her phone and opened an email Kirabo had forwarded to her the previous week. In it, Adrian instructed the legal department to complete the transfer process before the company's 25th anniversary celebration. He also emphasized that every public document should describe the designs as shared corporate assets. This is no longer about your husband enjoying the spotlight, Salome said. He is preparing to transfer the right to your work to another legal entity without your consent. Kirabo rose and walked to the window. In the distance, Kampala's hills appeared through a thin layer of haze. She had once believed that having her name erased from the documents was the most painful part, but now she understood that Adrian was not merely taking away recognition. He was turning her silence into consent. I do not want to destroy the company, Kirabo said. Protecting your rights is not destroying the company. Hundreds of employees work there. Many families depend on those monthly salaries. Salome closed the file. Her expression was not cold, but it gave Kirabo nowhere to hide. And because you are always thinking about everyone else, no one has ever been forced to think about you. The words made Kirabo turn around. Salome reminded her that this was not the first time her name had been erased. 3 years earlier, Salome herself had found an interview that described Adrian as the designer of the Kalema Crown Hotel. At the time, Kirabo had said she did not want to create a scandal because the company was negotiating a loan. The following year, another presentation used her photographs and notes without attribution, but she let it go because Flavia was receiving treatment for a heart condition. Every reason had been understandable. The result was always the same. Kirabo sat down, opened the first contract, and looked at her own signature. Back then, she had only recently entered the Sentotongo family, full of hope that her talent and Adrian strengthened each other. She had never imagined she would need a legal barrier against the man who had promised to protect her. I am not ready to sue him, Kirabo said. Then, what do you want? I want a document strong enough to stop the transfer if he continues. Salome took out a blank sheet of paper and began writing the necessary terms. The notice would require the company to halt every transfer, amendment, or relicense involving the 27 designs. If any unauthorized use occurred, Kirabo would have the right to suspend every existing license until authorship had been formally verified. Once you sign it, you do not have to send it immediately, Salome said. But you need to understand something. Keeping evidence is not the same as protecting yourself. Evidence only matters when you are willing to use it. Kirabo held the brass mechanical pencil and turned it slowly between her fingers. She remembered Adrian telling her in his office that she did not need to concern herself with those procedures. Perhaps he had been right about one thing. This was no longer a procedure. Salome completed the draft, placed it inside a cream-colored envelope, and sealed it. Kirabo looked at her full name written across the fronted, not reduced, not placed after her husband's name, and not replaced by the phrase, the internal team. She placed the envelope inside her briefcase. For the first time in years, Kirabo's silence was no longer surrender. It was preparation. Soft jazz music drifted through Adrian and Kirabo's glass villa in Kologo in Kampala. More than 30 members of the Sentongo family sat around long tables covered with ivory linens, raising their glasses to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Kintu Meridian developments. Crystal light shone over vibrant gomesi dresses, elegant suits, and the bronze feature wall Kirabo herself had designed. No one knew that a sealed envelope rested inside the leather bag beside her chair. Adrian stood before the dinner table with a glass of wine raised in his hand and recounted the company's journey from a small office to a real estate development group known across Uganda. He thanked his late father for laying the foundation, thanked Flavia for protecting the family's reputation, and then invited Maleka to stand beside him. My sister has brought a new aesthetic language to Meridian, Adrian announced. Her ideas will lead the Lake Victoria Resort project. Applause filled the room. Malaka smiled and placed a hand over her chest as though she were too emotional to speak. Behind the siblings, a large screen displayed the 27 designs Kirabo had created. The curves, gardens, and lighting details she had spent years developing now appeared under Malaika's name. Kirabo did not applaud. Joel Muwanga, the company's operation director, sat at a table near the stage. When he looked at Kirabo, he lowered his head briefly and quickly turned away. Joel had attended many of the design meetings and knew exactly who had created those drawings, yet he remained silent. Adrian finished his speech and returned to the main table. He leaned toward his wife's ear. "You are drawing attention. I am only sitting here." Then smiled. Kirabo looked at her husband. For 8 years, she had straightened his tie before every presentation, stood behind him checking every figure, and reminded him of the artisans who deserved to be thanked. Tonight, Adrian did not want her to speak. He only wanted her to look grateful. Flavia noticed the tension and immediately lifted her glass, inviting everyone to toast the new project. She said the Sesentongo family had always remained strong because every member knew how to place the common good above personal pride. Several relatives nodded in agreement, while Malaika walked over and placed an arm around Kirabo's shoulders as a gesture of reconciliation. "Do not be upset," she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "When the project succeeds, all of us will benefit." Kirabo gently removed Malaika's hand. "Did you tell everyone that I created those designs?" The smile on Malaika's face stiffened. "This is not the time to discuss that. Then, when will the right time be?" Several conversations around the table stopped. Adrian set his glass down sharply and ordered Kirabo to follow him into the study, but she did not stand. She looked at the screen behind him, where the central lobby design was being presented as Malaika's achievement. Kirabo opened her bag and removed the documents. Adrian's face lost its color when he recognized the cream-colored envelope bearing the seal of Solomi's law office. He reached for it, but Kirabo placed her hand over the top. "You prepared to transfer my 27 designs to Meridian Lakeside Holdings without telling me." The people seated closest to them began exchanging glances. Flavia said Kirabo's name, her voice carrying both warning and concern. She asked her to keep company matters out of a family celebration. Kirabo looked at her mother-in-law. The family brought company matters onto this stage. Adrian leaned toward his wife and lowered his voice. "You are humiliating me in front of everyone. I am only telling the truth. You are my wife. You do not get to ruin this evening simply because your name is missing from a folder." Kirabo stood, holding the envelope against her chest. She explained that she had not sued the company, had not released the documents publicly, and had not asked a single employee to take her side. She only wanted Adrian to stop the transfer and correctly name the person who created the designs. A simple request. Adrian looked around the room. His uncles, aunts, and longtime business partners were waiting for his response. He could have apologized, suggested they speak privately, or admitted that the documents needed to be corrected. But pride chose for him. "Give me the envelope," Adrian ordered. No, he grabbed Kirabo by the wrist. She pulled her hand away, causing the envelope to fall onto the table. As several people rose from their seats, Adrian stepped forward and struck his wife across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the room. No one moved. Kirabo's face turned to one side. Her bronze earring trembled slightly, and a red handprint slowly appeared on her cheek. Flavia dropped her wine glass onto the floor. Malaika stepped backward, both hands rising to cover her mouth. Joel gripped the edge of the table, but still did not step forward. Adrian stared at his own hand, as though even he could not believe what he had done. "Kirabo?" he began. She turned back to face him. She did not cry. She did not scream. Kirabo bent down, picked up the envelope, removed the executive access card from around her neck, and placed both items on the table. Her voice was so calm that everyone had to hold their breath to hear her clearly. You just slapped the woman who built your reputation. Adrian opened his mouth but could not speak. Kirabo pushed the envelope toward him. This notice takes effect tonight. I am withdrawing permission to use all 27 designs until their authorship has been formally verified. Malaika turned pale. The 18,760,000,000 Ugandan shilling project could not proceed without those designs. Flavia Till called for Kirabo to come back, but she only picked up her bag and looked at every person seated around the table. I am not taking anything away from this family, she said. I am simply no longer allowing you to use what never belonged to you. Then Kirabo walked out of the room she had designed herself. This time, no one was brave enough to tell her that she needed to endure. The following morning, Kirabo sat by the window of Solome's apartment in Nakasero, watching lines of traffic move down the hill towards central Kampala. Sunlight fell across the small wooden table where an ice pack, her silenced phone, and the brass mechanical pencil she had carried away from the villa the night before were resting. The redness on her cheek had begun to fade, but the memory of Adrian's hand striking her in front of the entire family remained painfully clear. She did not cry. What hurt Kirabo most was not the slap itself. It was the moment immediately after that sharp sound when more than 30 relatives had witnessed what happened and not one of them stepped between her and Adrian. Flavia dropped her glass. Malaika backed away. Joel gripped the edge of the table. Everyone else lowered their eyes as though silence could make the violence disappear. Solomon placed a cup of hot ginger tea in front of her. Do you want to go to the hospital? The injury is not serious. I am not only asking about the injury. Kirabo watched the thin steam rise from the cup. For years, she had solved everything through planning. If a drawing was wrong, she corrected it. If a client changed direction, she adjusted. If Adrian forgot a meeting, she quietly rearranged the schedule and made sure he arrived on time. But no blueprint had ever taught her how to rebuild her life. After the husband she once trusted humiliated her publicly, her phone lit up again. 17 missed calls from Adrian, 6 messages from Flavia, 3 from Malaika. Her mother-in-law's final message contained only one sentence: come home before a family matter becomes the business of all Kampala. Kirabo read it twice and placed the phone down. Flavia had not asked whether she was hurt. She was only afraid that outsiders would find out. Solomon pulled out the chair opposite her. She explained that Kirabo had the right to report the assault, request a protective order, and direct all future communication through her lawyer. Kirabo listened but did not answer immediately. She did not want to act out of anger, nor did she want to look back one day and wonder whether she had used the law only to make Adrian suffer. I need distance, she said, but I do not want this to become an act of revenge. Setting boundaries is not revenge. What about the company? Solomon exhaled slowly. Even after everything that had happened, Kirabo was still thinking about the employees, suppliers, and families who depended on Kintu Meridian. It was one of her finest qualities, but it was also the door others had used to cross her boundaries for years. You do not have to save everyone in the same morning, Sosom said. At that moment, Kirabo received an urgent email from Joel Mwanga. The subject line read, regarding the rights to use the designs. Joel confirmed that the investor group had paused due diligence on the 18,760,000 Ugandan shilling deal. The legal department had discovered that the company had no authority to transfer the 27 designs to Meridian Lakeside Holdings without Kirabo's signature. He also admitted that he had known many of the designs were hers, yet had allowed the communications team to credit Adrian. At the end of the email, Joel wrote that his silence the previous night was something for which he would have to take responsibility. Kirabo did not feel victorious. She only felt exhausted. She opened her computer, accessed her private archive, and reviewed every original file. The earliest sketches contained dates, notes correspondence with artisans, and complete revision histories. Every line represented part of her life: sleepless nights, long research trips, and cold meals eaten beside a glowing screen. Everything was still there. Her name was still there. While Kirabo reviewed the files, Adrian sent a voice message. His voice sounded hoarse and urgent, but his apology did not come until after nearly a minute of explaining the pressure he had been under. He said the slap had been wrong, but then added that suspending the design licenses could cause hundreds of employees to lose their jobs. Kirabo listened to the entire message. Then she deleted it, not because she refused to hear an apology, but because it was not yet an apology. Adrian was still placing the consequences on her shoulders, as though the company were in danger because she had responded, rather than because he had taken credit for his wife's work, attempted to transfer it, and struck her when she confronted him. Kirabo opened a blank document. She wrote 4 conditions. First, the company had to formally acknowledge in writing that she was the author of the 27 designs. Second, every transfer to the subsidiary had to stop until a new agreement was reached. Third, an independent audit had to identify every project that had used her work without properly recognizing her ownership. Fourth, Adrian was not permitted to contact her directly or appear wherever she was staying without her consent. Solom read each line and then asked, "What about the marriage?" Kirabo looked at the ring on her fingers. She removed it and placed it beside the brass pencil, but she did not throw it away. "The marriage will not be decided by one panicked apology," she replied. "It will be decided by what he does when he no longer has the power to control me." By noon, the formal notice had been sent to the board of directors, Adrian and Flavia. Kirabo made no threats, demanded no compensation, and did not expose the family matter publicly. She simply stated the boundaries necessary to protect her ownership, safety, and dignity. A few minutes later, Adrian called from an unknown number. Kirabo did not answer. She walked to the window and looked out at Kampala moving beneath the sunlight. The city remained noisy, vast, and filled with roads she had never traveled. For 8 years, Kirabo had helped Adrian build an empire bearing his family's name. That morning, she began laying the first foundation for a life bearing her own. Kirabo entered the 12th floor conference room of Kintu Meridian Developments with Solome. She wore an amber-brown suit over an olive-green silk blouse, her hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck. The swelling on her cheek hawk had gone down, but it was still visible enough to make the people seated around the table avoid looking directly at her. The chair to Adrian's right remained empty. For years, that had been Kirabo's place during important meetings. She would arrange the documents in the correct order, quietly correct the figures Adrian misread, and pass him the notes he needed before investors began asking questions. Today, she did not move toward that chair. Kirabo sat across from her husband. After receiving everyone's consent, Solom placed a recording device on the table. Flavia, Malaika, Joel Mwanga, attorney Bernard Kato, and 4 members of the board were also present. Adrian looked more exhausted than he had the last time Kirabo saw him. His white shirt was still perfectly pressed, but his eyes no longer carried the confidence of a man who believed he could control every room he entered. The chairman of the board opened the meeting by confirming that the resort deal had been temporarily suspended. The investors had not withdrawn, but they demanded a clear resolution regarding authorship rights, the company's governance structure, and Adrian's responsibility for what had happened at the family dinner. Flavia immediately objected. "That was a matter between husband and wife," she said. "We cannot allow one moment of anger to destroy the company my husband spent his entire life building." Kirabo did not interrupt her. Solom opened the file and presented copies of the 27 designs, the timestamps, and the contractual clauses proving that Kirabo retained ownership. She also confirmed that her client had not requested financial compensation, had not made the incident public, and had not suspended any projects already under construction. The restriction applied only to transfers, new licensing agreements, or the use of the designs in the expansion deal. "My client is protecting the employees from unnecessary consequences," Solom said. "But her compassion must not be mistaken for the surrender of her rights." Malaika sat upright, gripping her tablet with both hands. She admitted that she had agreed to let her name appear in the project presentation, but insisted that it had only been a communications decision made by Adrian. According to her, She had never personally claimed authorship in front of Kirabo. Joel turned toward Malaika. You stood on that stage and accepted praise while your sister-in-law's drawings were displayed behind you. Malaika's face turned pale. I did not know the situation was this serious. You did not need to understand the law to know that work was not yours. Flavia called Joel ungrateful. She reminded him that the Sentongo family had given him a job when he had just graduated from university and helped him rise to the position of operations director. Joel remained silent for several seconds before replying that gratitude could not require a person to continue protecting wrongdoing. The words made the room feel colder. Adrian still had not spoken. He watched Kirabo as though waiting for a familiar sign from her, a softened expression, a small nod, or some concern for the company. But she only opened the notebook in front of her, held the brass pencil between her fingers, and waited for him to take responsibility on his own. Finally, Adrian spoke. I am sorry I hit you. No one moved. He admitted that his action was indefensible, but immediately followed the apology with an explanation. He said he had been pushed to his limit by the pressure, the confrontation in front of family, and the risk of losing the largest deal in the company's history. Adrian insisted that he had never intended to steal his wife's work. He had only wanted to bring all the company's creative assets under one unified brand to attract investment. Kirabo closed her notebook. Are you apologizing for hitting me, or are you explaining why I made you hit me? Adrian froze. Flavia interrupted, saying Kirabo should not analyze every word after her husband had humbled himself enough to apologize before the entire board. She argued that a man carrying great responsibility could sometimes make mistakes and that thoughtful wife should give him the opportunity to correct them. Kirabo turned toward her mother-in-law. I gave Adrian 8 years to correct the way he treated my work. The slap was simply the first time everyone saw what happened when I stopped in being silent. Flavia had no answer. Kirabo placed her 4 conditions on the table. The company had to formally recognize her authorship, correct her name across every document, conduct an independent audit, and establish an ethics committee that would not be controlled by members of the Sentongo family. Adrian had to temporarily step away from executive authority during the investigation, and Malaika could not participate in any decision involving the design department. One board member asked whether Kirabo would return to work if her conditions were met. She looked at the empty chair beside Adrian. I will not return as the wife who stands behind the chief executive and corrects every mistake he makes, she said. If the company wants to work with me, we will sign a new agreement as 2 independent parties. Adrian leaned forward. You are turning us into strangers. No, Kirabo replied. I am only refusing to pretend that marriage gives you ownership over me. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the board voted. 6 of the 8 members agreed to temporarily suspend Adrian's executive authority, begin an independent audit, and formally recognize Kirabo as the legal author of the 27 designs. The resolution passed. Adrian remained motionless as the secretary collected his executive access card. Flavia closed her eyes, while Malaika lowered her head toward the dark screen in front of her. No one was humiliated, no one was threatened, and no one raised their voice. There were only consequences. Kirabo stood and placed the brass pencil inside her bag. Before leaving the room, she looked at the chair that had once been reserved for her beside her husband. It was still empty. But for the first time, Kirabo did not feel that she had lost her place. She had chosen a position from which no one could ever erase her name. Kirabo stood before the wooden door of a small design studio in Bugolobi, Kampala. The sign outside had faded with age, while inside there were only 6 work tables, a material shelf, and glass windows that allowed sunlight in from the narrow garden behind the building. It was the same space she had rented at the beginning of her career, before marrying Adrian and moving all her work into Kintu Meridian Developments. The room was smaller than she remembered, but it belonged to her. Solom had helped Kirabo sign a 6-month lease. She did not purchase expensive furniture, hire a large team, or use any money from the couple's joint account. Kirabo brought only her personal computer, several boxes of old material samples, and the brass mechanical pencil that had remained with her since the first day of her career. 2 partnership proposals rested on the table. One came from the board of Kintu Meridian. They agreed to formally recognize Kirabo's authorship, conduct an independent audit, and sign a temporary licensing agreement so that projects already under construction would not be delayed. The second came from a group of women operating an eco-resort near Lake Bunyoni. They wanted Kirabo to design a vocational training center for local artisans. For years, Kirabo had always placed Adrian's family fitness first. This time, she read the second proposal before the first asked. A knock sounded at the door. Joel Muwanga entered carrying a grey document box. He had voluntarily stepped away from his role as operations director while the investigation continued, even though the board had not required him to do so. Joel said he needed to accept responsibility for repeatedly approving documents that removed Kirabo's name. "I did not come here to ask you to protect my job," he said. "I came to return what should have been preserved properly from the beginning." Inside the box were copies of emails, meeting minutes, and altered communications materials. One old article had originally identified Kirabo as the lead architect, but Malaika had requested that the line be replaced with Meridian's creative team. An award nomination bearing Kirabo's name had also been withdrawn, so Adrian could be listed as the company's representative. Joel had also brought a list of 13 employees who had worked directly under Kirabo's guidance. "I was not the only one who knew the truth," he said. "We simply became accustomed to letting you carry it alone." Kirabo closed the box. She did not want Joel to kneel and beg for forgiveness, nor did she want to make him the only person responsible for a system that had benefited the entire Sentong family. She asked only that he cooperate honestly with the auditors and protect any employees who might face pressure for giving testimony. Joel agreed. Before leaving, he placed his employee access card on the table. "I do not know whether I will return to Meridian," he said. "But if I do not want to continue working in a place where loyalty is measured by a person's willingness to hide the truth." Kirabo watched him leave. She realized that accountability did not always appear in the form of punishment. Sometimes it began when someone willingly gave up a secure position to correct the part of the wrongdoing that belonged to them. At noon, the board issued an internal announcement. The statement confirmed that Kirabo Nansubuga was the principal author of the 27 design collections previously presented under Adrian's name, Malaikom's name, or the phrase creative team. The company committed to correcting every file, project page, and document sent to its partners. Every name was returned to its rightful place. The response within the company came quickly. Some employees sent Kirabo messages of congratulations. Others apologized for remaining silent, but several messages accused her of damaging the family's reputation merely to receive recognition. Kirabo did not respond to any of the arguments. She knew that people accustomed to benefiting from a woman's silence would always call her voice selfish. That afternoon, Flavia arrived at the studio without warning. She wore a dark purple gomesi, carried a black leather handbag, and stood uneasily in the modest room. It was the first time she had entered a place Kirabo had built that did not carry the Sesentongo name. "Are you truly planning to abandon the entire family?" she asked. Kirabo invited her to sit, but Flavia remained standing. She said Adrian had not slept properly for several nights. Malaika was afraid to return to the office, and relatives had begun asking questions. According to her, Kirabo had already proven that she was right, so she should stop before everything became impossible to repair. "I am not trying to prove that I am right," Kirabo replied. "I have simply stopped living as though tolerating wrongdoing were a wife's responsibility." Flavia insists that Adrian was remorseful. He had begun anger management counseling and was prepared to apologize publicly if Kirabo returned to the villa. She said every marriage faced difficult periods and that family honor had to be protected through forgiveness. Kirabo looked at the woman who had repeatedly taught her to endure. Forgiveness does not mean returning to a place where you are still not safe. Flavia fell silent. Kirabo explained that she had not yet decided to end the marriage, but she would not return simply because Adrian was now suffering the consequences of his actions. If he truly changed, it would have to be demonstrated through time, accountability, and the way he treated people when he no longer possessed power. I do not need promises made in front of the family, Kirabo said. I need to see a different man on the days when no one is applauding him. For the first time, Flavia did not argue. She looked at the sketches on the walls and the samples of fabric, stone, and wood that Kirabo had arranged carefully throughout the room. Perhaps she was finally realizing that the empire she always claimed her son had built carried the fingerprints of the woman before her in nearly every corner. Before leaving, Flavia placed a key on the table. It belonged to the old storage room at the villa, where Kirabo's earliest models were still being kept. The things inside belong to you, Flavia said softly. Kirabo did not thank her immediately. She simply placed the key beside the brass mechanical pencil. After her mother-in-law left, Kirabo opened the proposal for the vocational training center. On the line identifying the person responsible for the design, her name was printed clearly, Kirabo Nansubuga, lead creative architect. She picked up her pen and signed. It was not the largest contract she had ever received, but it was the first one in years that did not require her to disappear so someone else could shine. Adrian stood outside Kirabo's design studio in Bugolobi, holding a brown cardboard box and an unsealed envelope. Flavia was not with him. He had brought no lawyer, and he had not arrived in the luxury car that usually waited outside Kintu Meridian's headquarters. Adrian came by taxi, wearing a pale blue shirt and dark trousers, and stood outside for nearly 10 minutes before pressing the bell. Kirabo watched him through the glass. She did not open the door immediately. More than 6 weeks had passed since the dinner in Kololo. During that time, Adrian had respected the order not to contact her directly, attended behavioral and anger management counseling, and cooperated with the board's audit. He had also moved out of the villa so Kirabo could collect her belongings without having to see him. But doing the right thing after being forced to face consequences was not enough to prove that a person had changed. Kirabo called Solome and informed her that Adrian was standing outside. Only after confirming that the meeting was Kirabo's own decision and would take place in the studio, with employees working in the adjoining room, did she open the door. "You have 20 minutes, she said. Adrian nodded. He did not try to embrace her, use the old nickname he once called her, or ask why she had made him wait. He stepped inside and looked around the small room, at the material boards, the model of the vocational training center, and the sketches hanging along the walls. Kirabo's name was printed clearly on every document. "Your name looks right there," Adrian said. Kirabo did not respond to the compliment. She simply invited him to sit at the table near the window, keeping a distance between them. Adrian placed the box down, opened the lid, and removed the documents one by one. They were the drawings, notebooks, and miniature models that had been stored in the villa's archive room. Flavia had given Kirabo the key, but Adrian had personally sorted through everything. He had found the original sketch of the Kalama Crown lobby, the first notes for the lakeside resorts, and a yellow-covered notebook containing the concept that had helped the company win its first major contract. Kirabo's handwriting appeared in the corner of every page. Adrian had seen it many times before. He had simply never stopped long enough to understand what it meant. "I sent a written statement to the board," Adrian said. "I confirm that you are the author of all 27 designs. I also gave up any personal claim to ownership of these materials." Kirabo opened the envelope. Inside was a signed declaration from Adrian, along with a letter addressed to the employees and business partners. In it, he did not use phrases such as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate incident, or a family dispute. He admitted that he had accepted credit that did not belong to him, allowed the communications department to remove Kirabo's name, and attempted to transfer her creative assets to a subsidiary without her consent. He also wrote about the slap. "No explanation, no blame, only responsibility." "Are you going to release this letter?" Kirabo asked. "The board approved it. It will be sent tomorrow morning." Would you have done it if the board had not required you to? Adrian remained silent for a long time. I want to say yes, he replied. But 6 weeks ago, I probably would have still found a way to protect my image. I do not want to keep saying things that make me look better than the truth. It was the first time Kirabo had heard him admit his own limitations without turning them into an excuse. Adrian explained that his counselor had asked him to write down every moment when he had used power to end a conversation. He had come to understand that the slap had not appeared out of nowhere. It was the final result of years spent interrupting Kirabo, removing her name from documents, demanding that she smile, and calling her resistance an act of humiliation against the family. I thought I had only lost control for 1 second, Adrian said. But the truth is that I had trained myself to treat your silence as something I was entitled to. Kirabo kept both hands on the table, recognizing that does not erase what you did. I know, and I do not owe you forgiveness simply because you are trying to change. I know. Adrian did not ask her to return. He did not say the company needed her, nor did he mention their good years to make the terrible ones seem smaller. He only told her that he had submitted his resignation as chief executive instead of remaining temporarily suspended. The board could appoint a new leader while he would retain only his inherited shares and stay out of management for at least 2 years. Kirabo was surprised, but she did not show it. Did Flavia agree? No, then why did you do it? Because for the first time, I understood that keeping that position would allow me to continue believing I was the one who had lost something. Beyond the glass, the late afternoon sunlight spread across the studio floor. Kirabo looked at the man sitting before her and saw a different Adrian, but not yet one she could trust to remain different. 6 weeks could create regret. Only time could create accountability. She told him she was not ready to return to the villa, not ready to continue the marriage, and not yet able to decide whether they still had a future together. Adrian nodded and accepted her answer without negotiation. Before standing, he pushed the box toward Kirabo. These belong to you. Kirabo looked at him. They have always belonged to me. Adrian lowered his head. Yes, it simply took me far too long to say it. He left the studio alone. Kirabo did not run after him, nor did she remain at the door watching him disappear. She carried the box to her desk, removed the yellow-covered notebook, and turned to the first page. Beneath an old sketch was a sentence she had written before she ever met Adrian. A good space should give people the right to exist without asking permission. Kirabo read it again, slowly. For years she had designed that principle into every building, yet had never given it to herself. Now, whether the marriage healed or ended, she knew she would never again enter a room that required her to become smaller so someone else could feel powerful. This time, Kirabo did not need the entire family to fall silent. She only needed them to learn how to listen. Kirabo stood in the courtyard of the newly completed Bunyoni Center for Traditional Crafts south of Kampala. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the terracotta walls, sloping tiled roofs, and wide corridors opening toward a garden filled with native plants. Laughter from the artisans drifted out of the weaving room, blending with the soft tapping hammers from the woodworking studio. A clear inscription appeared on the bronze plaque beside the entrance. Lead designer, Kirabo Nansubuga. Adrian's name was not beside hers. Kintu Meridian's name was not above it. There was only her name. Nearly a year had passed since the night Kirabo was struck in front of the Setongo family. During that time, the small studio in Bugolobi had grown into a design firm with 11 young architects, engineers, and artisans. Kirabo had not hired them to build an empire bearing her name. She had hired them because she wanted to create a place where no one had to disappear so someone else could be seen. Every project clearly named the person responsible. Every idea had an acknowledged owner. Kingdom Meridian had changed as well. An independent female chief executive had been appointed through an open recruitment process. The new ethics committee required every document to identify its authors and principal contributors. Joel Mwanga returned as an operations advisor after completing his testimony, while Malaika moved into the community relations department with limited authority. Adrian did not return to the chief executive's chair. He sold part of his shares to settle the obligations that emerged from the audit and used another portion to establish a mental health support program for senior managers. He continued attending counseling regularly, but he never used it to demand that Kirabo acknowledge he had changed. They continued to live separately. They did not rush into divorce, nor did they reconcile quickly to satisfy the family. Once a month, Adrian and Kirabo met at the office of a marriage counselor. During some sessions, they discussed only documents, assets, and responsibilities. During others, Adrian had to listen as Kirabo described 8 years of having her name erased without interrupting to explain himself. Healing moved slowly, slower than an apology. Flavia arrived at the opening ceremony wearing a teal gomesi. She did not come with a procession of relatives as she once might have, nor did she ask to sit in the place of honor. She stood behind the women artisans and waited patiently until Kirabo finished speaking with the construction team before approaching her. "The building is beautiful," she said. "Thank you, mother." The way Kirabo addressed her made her slightly. She still called her mother, but the easy closeness they had once shared was gone. Kirabo had learned that respect could exist alongside distance. Flavia looked at the bronze plaque. "I used to believe a woman's name mattered less than keeping peace in the family." Kirabo remained silent and waited for her to continue. "I was wrong." There was no music and no crowd turned to witness the admission. Flavia did not cry or kneel to ask forgiveness. She simply acknowledged that she had taught her son to treat his wife's endurance as something natural because she had lived the same way in her own marriage. "I called it strength," Flavia said, "but perhaps it was only fear passed from one woman to another." Kirabo watched the students entering their first class. She understood that Flavia's apology could not change the past, but it might prevent part of that past from being repeated. "We cannot repair what we refuse to name correctly," Kirabo replied. Flavia nodded. A car stopped outside the gate. Adrian stepped out holding a small wooden box. He wore a simple gray suit and waited at the entrance until Kirabo noticed him. He no longer assumed his presence would automatically be welcome. Kirabo walked toward him. "You came. You sent me an invitation. I invited you as a guest. I understand." Adrian handed her the box. Inside was the brass mechanical pencil, its loose clip repaired. Kirabo had left it behind at the counselor's office after one of their sessions several months earlier. Adrian had not kept it for himself, engraved his name on the box, or turned the gift into a symbol of ownership. "I thought you might need it for your speech," he said. Kirabo lifted the pencil. It was still the shame object, only steadier. "Thank you." Adrian looked at the building behind her. He said he had read the project brochure and noticed that Kirabo had dedicated part of the center to free classes for adult women who wanted to relearn a trade after spending years caring for their families. He did not call it a wonderful idea belonging to us. He called it her work. When the ceremony began, Kirabo stepped onto the platform. Adrian sat in the third row beside Flavia and behind the artisans who had directly built the center. No member of the Sesentongo family was placed more prominently than the people who had actually created the building. Kirabo did not speak about the slap. She did not turn her speech into a story about a woman defeating her husband. She thanked every architect, carpenter, weaver, engineer, and project coordinator by name. Then she said that a community could truly develop only when labor was not taken by those with greater power. "No one should have to choose between being loved and being respected," Kirabo said. "A family, a company, or a marriage can endure only when every person is allowed to exist under their own name." Applause filled the courtyard. Adrian was not the first to stand. He waited until the artisans, employees, and students rose before slowly joining the crowd. Kirabo noticed and understood that he was learning a lesson that might have seemed small. He did not always need to be the first person others saw. After the ceremony, Adrian asked whether he could invite her for coffee the following week. He did not call it a date or mention returning to the same home. Kirabo considered the request and nodded. "We can talk." It was not a promise that the marriage would be saved. It was only an acknowledgement that a small door could be opened when the person outside had finally learned to knock. Kirabo turned and looked at the center in the golden evening light. Nearly a year earlier, she had walked out of the villa she designed with one cheek burning red and a legal envelope in her hand. At the time, she believed she was losing her family, her career, and the life she had built. But she had not lost them. She had only stopped holding up structures that depended on her disappearance. And from that ground, Kirabo built a different kind of home, where love was no longer used to conceal power. Forgiveness did not replace accountabilities, and no woman had to ask permission for her name to appear on the work created by her own hands. Kirabo's story reminds us that a marriage, a family, or a business can endure only when it is built on respect, honesty, and accountability. Love should never be used as a reason to tolerate disrespect, and it should never become an excuse for someone to take away another person's work, voice, or dignity. Forgiveness is a beautiful choice, but forgiveness does not mean erasing consequences or agreeing to return to an environment that is not truly safe. Sometimes the most courageous decision is not to remain and endure, but to stay calm enough to establish boundaries and protect your own worth. In my view, respect must always come before love, because once respect disappears, love becomes very difficult to sustain. Everyone deserves to receive proper recognition for what they have contributed, and no one should ever have to make themselves smaller so someone else can shine. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe someone can truly change after facing the consequences of their actions? And do not forget to tell us which city you are watching from. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you will not miss the next episode.